All right. Good evening to all our friends joining in from different parts of the world, particularly from South Asia, all our media fraternity belonging to the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia based in New Delhi. A hearty welcome to this particular webinar. If I'm not mistaken, this is webinar number 10 during these troubling times of COVID-19. And today is a very interesting subject where we are talking about journalism. Is only bad news good news? And it's a special lecture by Mr. Roland SCHATZ. I would now like to hand over to the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia, Mr. S. Venkat Narayan, to introduce all the panel and our special speakers today. And then I will come back to moderate the session and Q&A. Let me, before we start, again, one of you, please. I don't know whether it's Simranji. Are you wearing headsets?
No, I'm not wearing headsets.
Yeah, because somebody has to, because we are getting an echo back. It's going to be very bad. If you can use your headset, I would really appreciate it. Vinita and Simran. Vinita ji, are you wearing
I'm not
headset?
getting an echo. I'm quite okay, but I'll find my headset.
Okay.
Okay.
Venkat, in the meantime, please go ahead.
Yeah. A warm welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to you, Roland SCHATZ, for joining us all the way from Vienna in Austria. This is possibly the first time in the history of the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia that we are doing a webinar with somebody sitting thousands of miles away in Europe. And so that is definitely a bit of history. We are also joined by colleagues from other press clubs located in Delhi. We have Anand Sahai, he is the president of the Press Club of India. And we have Vinita Pandey, she is secretary of the Indian Women Press Corps. We have with us Timothy, he is the South Asia Bureau Chief of the AFP. We have Sanjeev Miglani, acting chief of Reuters in New Delhi. Then we have, of course, Munish, who is the secretary of the club, and Dr. Wael Awad. He is the India correspondent of Syrian Arab News Agency and a former president of the FCC. He is possibly the only Arab journalist who speaks Arabic, and he has been living in Delhi for several decades. And he informs the world about what is going on in India in the language the Arabs understand. So we are delighted to have all of you with us. You know, the Roland belongs to a family which has been in journalism for more than 150 years. His great-great-great-grandfather started a newspaper on the border between Germany and Switzerland 150 years ago, sometime in 1870. Then the family has survived First World War, Second World War, Hitler, and now we have Roland with us. Roland not only is a journalist who is passionate about trying to reform the way journalists operate, and they give more bad news than good news. And after reading a newspaper or watching a TV bulletin, people don't feel very comfortable, happy about the state of the affairs. And he would like the journalistic community, that includes journalists working for 100,000 publications and 1,000 TV channels in India and the rest of the world, to do something about the way they are telling the story of the world to their readers. After all, people form their opinions on the basis of what they read in the newspapers, what they watch on television, and at the end of finishing a newspaper or a television, a news bulletin, they are not quite comfortable about the state of the world. But on the other hand, it's not just a plane crash or a confrontation between Chinese and Indian troops in the Himalayas, or an act of terrorism, Kabul, or whatever, but the rest of the world, more than 7 billion people are living, reasonably okay. And if you read newspapers and watch TV channels these days, the COVID-19 dominates so much, it would seem nothing else is happening in the world. So how do we go about this constructive news, getting into news coverage, and what should we do about this? You have, Roland, been practically running a one-man crusade in favor of constructive journalism, news and journalism. It has had some impact in countries like Sweden, Belgium, Denmark. We would like to know how you propose to reach out to the entire global journalistic community to see that they reduce negativity and introduce some positivity, so that at the end of the day, a reader or a TV viewer does not go to bed feeling miserable about the state of the world on that particular day. I invite you, Roland, to make your comments. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and everybody who came to India is never forgetting your people, the progress you do, and I have India deep in my heart, especially since Noida and Greater Noida joined the SDG Cities Leadership Platform 2 years ago. And I'm looking forward to being able to come on a regular basis, not only to Noida, but as well to Mumbai and other parts of your wonderful country. The reason why I picked up on this topic is more because when you have a grandfather, as I have, who was no longer allowed to serve as a journalist right at the beginning in January 1933, on one hand, and on the other hand, you read so many historical comparisons now in these days of Corona, you get a little bit nervous by what is presented in the evening news, what you read in the newspapers, what you listen on radio, and especially what those who claim themselves of being social media, how they describe what is going on. And as in my case, I decided 25 years ago to set up an institute which is called Media Tenor, where we have teams all around the world watching the evening news story by story and analyzing what are the themes, which people are presented, what is the overall framing of a story, what is seen, and more important, what is not seen and not told. One can't do anything different than stand up and ask the question, are we on the right path right now? Is the way how we describe the situation caused by Corona, is this helping us to make fair judgments? Is it helping governments making fair judgments? And are we able to move forward to improve the lives of the people living in Mumbai, in Noida, but not only in India, but as well in Vietnam, in China, in Europe, in America, all over the world? Or are we maybe facing a situation which social scientists would call self-fulfilling prophecies? What am I talking about? When you get at this stage where I am after 25 years, and you listen to the headline news, already in February, you get a déjà vu effect. To me, I had the impression, wait a minute, I saw this already. I saw this when our colleagues tried to cover the mad cow disease, when they tried to cover swine flu, bird flu, different crises caused in the area of health, but as well when we try to cover 9/11, when we try to cover the Lehman collapse, the finance collapse, when we try to cover the Greek crisis, which is now called the Euro crisis. Looking back, in our data, we have for sure 9 crises before COVID happened. And in all these 9 crises, there were few things always the same. Our colleagues were tempted to invite scientists to share certain data. But unfortunately, looking back, you realized when they presented these scientists, they mostly took what a scientist would call his worst case scenario. You would not see the best case scenario, and you wouldn't see anything in between. What you would see is the extreme potential happening scenario possible. And they would repeat this worst case scenario. And if the scientist would, after a while, say, well, wait a minute, I have the other scenarios as well. Why are you not presenting these? It would be most likely that this scientist would no longer make it into the headline news. I saw this during swine flu. I saw this by 9/11 when we had these horrible pictures from New York with the terror attack. But unfortunately, we hardly saw any Islam face. We didn't see any expert representing the Muslim world who would give us an idea whether what happened in the so-called name of Islam was actually possible to be done backed by the Quran. We didn't see them. And I remembered back then that my father, when I was considering becoming a journalist, he taught me, Roland, if you are not presenting the other side, semper audiatur et altera pars, this very old Latin word, always show the other side. If I would miss out on this, I would not only catch the story wrong, but I would hurt my own profession, because we, the journalists, are known for giving both sides of the picture. Now, fast forward, this year in March, I had the impression that the journalists, if it wouldn't be COVID, but if it would be a soccer game, they would present only the goals scored by one team next day. And they would miss out the goals scored by the other team. You might remember the World Soccer Championship in Brazil, where Germany played Brazil. There could have been a big temptation for our friends who serve as journalists in Brazil that they would have said one day after Germany played Brazil that Brazil scored a goal, which was absolutely true. The Brazils scored a goal. But unfortunately, Germany scored 7 goals. And no journalist in this world would ever go live with the result 1 goal scored by Brazil without giving news to the 7 goals scored by Germany. But why are we doing it when it comes to health? Why are we doing it when it comes to economy? I can give you the numbers which were in the evening news, in German evening news, in Swiss evening news, in Austrian evening news in the beginning of March. You would see the numbers of infected on corona, and you would see a second number, those who died either with corona or because of corona. You would not see how many tests were done, and you wouldn't see how many recovered. I immediately asked myself, why are these 2 numbers missing? It can happen one evening, although I'm not so sure if this should happen even on one evening. But it happened next evening again. And the third evening, it happened the first 2 weeks. Are we talking here about journalism, or are we talking about something else? It came along as the BBC News of Switzerland, the BBC News of Austria, and the BBC News of Germany. But from what I was taught in school at university, this wasn't journalism. If you announce in regards to Corona only the number of those who died and only those who got infected without at the same time showing the total of how many tests were done and how many were recovered, you have to ask yourself, whose job are you doing? Are you still working as a journalist, or are you doing somebody else's job? I wrote a piece about that after 2 weeks because I got really angry. And then they started to show at least the number of those recovered. But they still don't show the number of the total tests which were done. Just one example. Another example was in Europe, we saw evening after evening pictures from Italy. And these pictures were horrible. People were dying in Italy, yes. But what does that tell us to those who live in Germany, in Austria, or in Switzerland? The medical system in Italy has nothing in common with the medical system in Italy, in Germany, Austria, or Switzerland. Why? Because if you have a heart attack and you have an emergency car picking you up, the driver of the car would not drive you to the next hospital. He would call in advance and find out whether there's a bed where people can treat you, which is not the case in Italy. In Italy, the car picks you up and it drives you to the next hospital. That is why you had so many cases where people were lying in floors and no longer in beds, in rooms. But this is not comparable to the medical system in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. But what does this do, not only to the audience who is watching this type of news? What does this do to the politicians? They are human beings, and they are not only human beings, on top of being human beings, they are people who need to be re-elected. And you know what happened? Angela Merkel, Mr. Kurz, and the government in Switzerland, because they were under pressure, they took decisions which in the end caused a situation that almost the health system in Switzerland, in Austria, and in Germany broke. Why? Because they were no longer allowed to do surgery, which needs to be done as well to keep a hospital alive. The hospitals ended up in March, in April, in May, being almost empty. Why? Because people got scared going to see even their doctor, not to talk about going to an hospital, for their normal treatment regarding cancer, diabetes, and other diseases where you can die on. With our focus solely showing one sickness, one illness called Corona, we ended up as if there are no other deaths happening in this world, as if there are no more car accidents, as if there is no more somebody who's getting a heart attack. We had people, nurses, doctors, who had to file for unemployment money because people would no longer go to see their doctor. This is a very extreme example. But sometimes when we go to the extreme, we learn the best for the future, because thank God, although Corona is a very serious case, and I don't want to play it down by any means, but imagine this wouldn't be Corona, but it would be Ebola or something else. Where would we be today? So let me stop with this introductory remarks by just highlighting the point that if we don't have a situation where journalists are the ones who are able to think, what do we put on air and what not, where they make sure that they are not showing one group of scientists, but the whole variety which you need to see. Do you know what happened to the world by only seeing virologists with their numbers, by presenting statistics driven by artificial intelligence, where we had already a full-page story in the beginning in February in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, a very good newspaper in Switzerland, making sure that don't believe every number you get from artificial intelligence guys, because artificial intelligence guys can only be as good as the numbers they get presented to. And they were operating on a multiplier of 2 or 3, where actually they would have been much closer to reality if they had used the multiplier of 0.1 or 0.01, which again leads to complete different things. And let me close on the most important point. I saw so many politicians all over the world getting airtime like crazy. And all what they had to say was, keep distance and wear your mask, which is important. But as long as you don't say at the same time, you can go for a walk, you can take care of yourself by eating in a healthy way, have your vitamins, go and be outside and enjoy the sun. It is almost like my comparison with a soccer game, Germany versus Brazil. If we only focus on keeping distance and wearing masks, we are not doing our people a favor. Shall I stop here for the moment?
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Roland. That starts the conversation today on a very important subject, because we are part of the media fraternity and we're looking at current times and looking at the dynamics of current and future things to come. But good starting, because I know that Anand has to, I guess, take off. So I'm going to first invite Anand Sahai. He's the president of the Press Club of India. From India, the Indian viewpoint. Anand, the floor is yours.
Well, hi Manish, thank you.
Anand, can you unmute
I was
yourself?
just wondering whether oh yeah, sure. What do I do now?
Yeah, you're fine. You're fine.
You speak.
I'm
That's
okay.
all. Yeah, you're okay. Go ahead.
Okay, good. That's good news. That's good news. Okay. So I was wondering if Roland was using this COVID example as a case, on which he would build his main argument, but I think it looks like he might want to say things a little bit later also, and for now confine himself only to COVID, because this this subject that you gave us, whether bad news alone is good news. Now, unfortunately, I can't see anybody else. Can you gentlemen see me? Can you people see me? Hello?
Yeah, we can see
Can you
you.
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we can see and hear you. Anand, go ahead. Keep going ahead. We're just switching between different cameras.
All right. Okay. So I would not add too much to what Roland has said about the presentation of COVID in the news worldwide, or especially in Europe. He took examples from Europe in the main. Hi, Sanjeev, seeing you after a long time.
Yes.
Sanjeev.
Yes, I'm so happy to see you. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to see you. Yeah. So, no, those examples are very important. What you said, Roland, about the case of Italy, the way Italy was being presented, we saw exactly the same sort of thing happening in this city, in Delhi, where all of us live, other than you, I think, right now. People going from hospital to hospital, and then not living till the end of the day to tell the tale. That is what happened, and that accounted for a very large number of deaths. That's one. And number two, also to reconfirm what you just said from our own example of Delhi, that because all the attention is focused on COVID, therefore people who suffered from other very serious ailments, they were not given a chance for their normal health rounds of hospitals and doctors. So they suffered. Many died. That was a common feature. At the same time, if I may add this, that COVID got a lot of play. It's possible to argue no sickness in recent memory, not Ebola, not anything else, took the world of the world economy to the cleaners in the way that COVID has done. And therefore, could the COVID news been presented better? Yes, of course, that certainly is true, and I agree with you 100%. But in terms of a list of priorities, if we were to, in India, let me take the case of in India. Here we are having a serious problem with a very major world power on our borders. It's a border problem. A serious migration crisis, which, in my view, the politicians mishandled, created a big scare about, and therefore drove literally millions of the poorest Indians out of cities to seek shelter in their village because they thought that the big city would do nothing for them. They ran away. They were, in a sense, voting with their feet. In the efficacy of the present system here, the way we have it in India, to look after their welfare. So that was crisis number 2. And crisis number 3, already even before the COVID lockdowns began in India, our economy was a very big mess. COVID has made things far, far worse, but the economy was a big mess. So here we were faced with a border issue, a serious economic crisis. And of course, at the same time, we had this crisis in Kashmir, 1-year lockdown. We had this whole internal sense of instability on account of this medieval mosque being demolished and this whole sense of a false sense of solidarity of a particular religious group being created. All this is happening at the same time as COVID, and yet it is COVID which trumps the news cycle and the daily news, not only the television, but also the important newspapers. And I think you're damn right. To begin with, the discussion on COVID was puerile because most of our television in India is actually puerile because they are not looking for good news, they're not looking for bad news, they're looking for news that pleases them. And by them, I mean those who are running the show. And therefore, the agenda for the news cycle, in the way, the factors which govern the agenda in Europe, in North America, possibly in Australia, New Zealand, I don't know. But the agenda which drives the news cycle in a situation like ours, and I'm sure we are not unique. There are countries like this, around the globe, where the news agenda is not news cycle agenda for the cycle is not set in a news establishment. It is set elsewhere. It is set by the most powerful politicians, not even by the most by the most important money bags, let's say, though they do matter a lot. But the politicians in authority, the more you tend to democracy absenting itself, and the politics, the political dynamics in a country going on the authoritarian path, there I think professional news journalists, they are no longer in the driver's seat. And that is why you get rank bad journalism. I'm not saying that as individual journalists, we don't have excellent journalists. Here I find, at least I know one or two people here who are absolutely superb journalists. And perhaps I hope to God that their organizations let them go about their work in a professional manner. But alas, I cannot say if that holds true for a lot of other people, including newspapers, radio, and television, and certainly social media. On social media, authoritarianism is king, or the forces that drive authoritarianism in our society, in our political life, those are king, absolutely. So there is bad news all the way, Roland. And I really don't know if you asked a very, very good question and a very important question in your presentation, which was, if you're giving us one side of the picture, are you being a journalist? What are you being? At whose behest are you doing what you are doing? Or have you suddenly taken sannyas from your professional ethics for a certain duration? I honestly do not know the answer in Europe or the answer in North America, but I damn well know what the answers here are. You've done, you have a tremendous legacy. You have the wisdom of the ages. You've got the DNA, in you of 5 generations of journalism. I have only about around 40 years of journalism, So, you score over me by far as that is concerned. But frankly, to tell you the truth, in terms of, journalism, ethics, good ethics, bad ethics, man biting a dog is journalism, or dog biting a man is journalism, something unusual occurring, in our lives, is that journalism? What is journalism? These questions are extremely relevant, but they cease to have their relevance the minute journalists are themselves no longer driving the journalistic agenda. May I just stop here? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anand. Thank you. Thank you very much. To move from Roland to India, and now I'll go to another friend of ours who is in India and a very seasoned journalist, but not Indian. Tim, your take on the subject of today. Are you with us, Tim? Tim, can you unmute yourself?
I think it's a very controversial and unusual topic. But honestly, I'd like to hear more from Roland about this, and for people who've got their questions about it. Personally, I would just like to see the public and journalists set the agenda. I don't think we should be telling people how to choose news or anything like that. I'd rather hear more from Roland.
Okay, so you want to reserve your comments for now, and let me get a few more people to comment, and then we'll get back to Roland. Moving on to Dr. Awad on the subject, but just keep yourself brief, and we want to get back to then everybody, and then some Q&A from the audience.
Thank you, Monish. Thank you, Ronald and Anand. I think it's a very interesting subject to focus in. But I sometimes tell myself, because we work in the media, the electronic and television and the radio, we ask ourselves how much bad news should be a bad news to make it a good news. That's another question which always comes to my mind, because when I was covering the Iraqi war and there's a bomb blast or suicidal bombs, we were asked by the editorial board in our news channel, they will say, how many died? We say 4 or 5 people, it's not a good news. So if we say 50 people died, then it is good news to report. So I think there are factors which plays in also the negativity of the news, that because our mindset and psychology is based on the negativity which we remember more than with the positive of the news we remember. So these factors depends basically on the media corporate, as Anand was saying, It depends on the editorial board as well, and also the how much ignorance of journalism these days, which have also a huge impact on the news coverage and giving the news to the public, because every channel are now looking for audience. And the audience you're looking for is that you wanted to improve your BTR rate, and you want to improve your audience shares and all these factors, so you can have ads more in the paper. So it is more of commercializing of the news rather than being a real journalism in this era. And I think digital news have also played a major role. So my really take on this is that what could be the impact of a bad news? And let's take country-wise. If we look at certain countries where the bad news make the top of the news for 90% of the news supposedly in the United States, we can say it is only war and terrorism. It comes and they sell it out. But I also ask myself with the COVID-19, why terrorism have been taking a second steps after, and there is not much of terrorist activities, by the way, during this episode. Is it something to do with the smearing campaign that they want us to listen to in the media, on the global media? Or are we trying to sell our news to our audience to have our share of the worldview?
Thank you, Dr. Awad. Let me go to Simran here. Simran, your take on the subject, and what do you feel is good news allowed to be reported, or is good news suppressed by the people who run these organizations? And as Tim said, it's a controversial subject, but let's hear some controversy.
No, one thing I wanted to ask Roland also is, we and Anas Sahai also referred to it. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, we can.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
So, there's this, I was also reading a bit of Roland's writings, which Venkat had sent us. And, he also mentioned it, that as journalists, we tend to cover and write more about the people in authority. But I think as a journalist, you also face a conflict. If someone's in authority and say the person's a prime minister or a president, and they do something, you have to report it, whether it's positive or it's negative, whether it's good journalism or bad journalism, according to me. For example, I think you look at President Trump and you see the kind of tweets that he does regularly. The point is, as a journalist, I don't think anyone can choose, do I do a story on this or do I not do a story on this? One has to do a story because he's the president of the US and he has tweeted something, whether it is on race or it is on foreign relations. So I think as a journalist, to every time ask a journalist to make this judgment is, I think, a little unfair, because I think reportage is also based on facts. And I think when it comes to judgments, we have to shift more to columns and editorials. That's the distinction I would like to make, not only in Indian journalism, I think globally also. And I see CNN sometimes doing hour-long programs, which is only on Trump's tweets. And I also feel, what is the option? You have to report what he's saying, even if you don't like what he's saying and it is bad news.
That's a very interesting, sort of angle you've taken to the subject. Let me ask other colleagues here. Let me come to Sanjeev Miglani, Reuters, one of the large agencies covering India. And let's look at India and the situation here. Where does developmental journalism sit in all this? I mean, are we focusing on developmental journalism, or it's just facts of the negative facts of the day determining what we put out in the news? Sanjeev, you have to unmute yourself. Sanjeev, unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. The challenges of technology. This is a great question in the sense that the amount of words, the amount of visuals that we generate every day, I think we have something like 1 million sort of words we are across a month we generate. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how much of that is what you said in terms of development. There is a fatigue, which Roland mentioned. There is a sense of fatigue. We can see it in our readership stats as well. We can see it now. People read 2 paras, and they read mostly on their phones and iPads. People are not reading all the way through, and there's so much information that's being sort of it's like an avalanche, yeah, and you're constantly sort of hooked on it. So you are just deluged by the end of the evening. How much of it is really how much of it is really some information that could make sense to you? How much of it is sort of driven by agendas like Anand mentioned? I think that's the big challenge now. And I guess Roland was trying to sort of mention some of it. This idea that you got to have both sides of the story. We are all trying this. This is an effort. We are all trying to bring both sides of a story, but it is a terribly polarized environment, as you know. I mean, it begins from America and goes all the way up here. It's hyper nationalism at its sometimes at its best, sometimes at its worst. So we are all struggling in that environment. I think it's very everything is sort of people drive sort of motives behind every news. We have ourselves become part of the news. To get back to Monish, and I'll quickly come back to it. I mean, quickly sort of close up. You talked about development. So in the middle of all this, we do want to focus on development. We try. I mean, we get sort of drowned in the other stuff, but we have also found that development stuff, and if it's a credible sort of narrative to it, there is demand for it. People want to read about development, absolutely, and development in the villages and from the rural sectors. So we've been sending people across the country. I mean, that's where the real India is, beyond Delhi and Noida, and but it's true that it gets lost in the high level noise that I'll stop here and listen to you.
Sanjeev, thank you. But I would just get back to a couple of important points made by all of you, but particularly what Simran said. You can't put the onus of deciding what the story of the day is and whether it's bad or good on simply the journalist itself, and say, don't report Trump because he makes, he puts out bad tweets, or don't only report this guy because he's political and he wants only Hindu, temple being promoted, Modi, whatever. But let me come to our friend Vinita here from IWPC. And Vinita, in the current context, starting for what and what's happening around us, what is the right thing in media schools before they come out into the media? Because it seems like unlike the old days, when you feel like them, by the flair of writing, and if you worked as an apprentice to some senior editors or people, you could join the profession. But now everybody is being coached and taught journalism and media, and then you come from an institute and you go intern in another company and then you join. So are people being taught the right kind of journalism? What is your experience?
I think a lot of people who are coming to journalism are coming with a predetermined, mindset. They're already biased. They have own role models, which may be, which is more TV generated, TV oriented. So because they see people on television, so they appreciate the whole dramatics and theatrics of television anchors. So when I was in one of the organization where I was also hiring a lot of journalists, and when I used to ask them that who is your role model, so they would name some of the journalists who I would at times wonder what kind of journalism are they doing. I mean, it's performance on television. So the new age journalists largely I find them very disillusioned and very confused compared to a lot of people whom I have seen in the past, and many of them who have really worked hard to become very good journalists. Some of them I have myself trained. Uh, and when we're talking about the good news and the bad news, the younger generation which is coming into media is it likes more of good news. They're millennials. They love happy stories. They love fashion, health, diet, lifestyle. But the sad stories, the painful stories, because also you have to go out in the field to do a lot of legwork to dig out the stories. Good stories come to you very easily, but for the stories that pinch you, that may shake your conscience, you have to really work hard. So I find that most of the time, and I'll say that not all of them, but many of the youngsters are not willing to go that extra mile to explore a story, to do something which is unusual. For example, if there was a riot in Northeast Delhi, And I could feel that a lot of were taken for a conducted tour where they were shown some areas and they went and they reported in a particular way. Possibly, this is how the countries are managing media these days, and uh, this is how the media is controlled. But I think some of them also went out and explored what the truth could be and the other side of the story. You have good news, you have bad news. Between black and white, there are different shades of gray. Let's talk about COVID. When they were in the middle of a lockdown in India, so one of our colleagues just said, after we had a prolonged lockdown, a colleague said that I think the people are getting depressed with so much of death and suffering around in this fear. So let's bring out some positive stories to to make people feel better. So I can understand that when we are reading every day that there's a lot of death happening, there's no medicine, and then you have to just lock yourself in, and you don't know whether if you're locked in, then still you're safe. So, amid those fearful stories came the first story of first survival. Then came story of plasma therapy, clinical trials. So you give hope. People want hope. But also, I see a pattern whenever there is a crisis, the government goes through. Maybe it's a poor economy, there is a political crisis, to divert the media from what we perceive as bad news towards good news. So a lot of journalists or media houses are fed with a lot of puff stories, or stories to give you those happy feelings that all is well in the country, everything's fine, and you're diverted to those issues, and you forget that there is a crisis in China, and you only talk about Rafale coming in, how great Rafale is. I mean, but you have a crisis at the border. So I think the younger generation which is coming into journalism has to find a balance, not I mean, not to come with a predetermined mind that we going to only do this kind of journalism. Journalism is very tough. It's difficult. You have to go out in deep areas to dig out stories. Migrant crisis. I will talk about migrant crisis during COVID. What started as a general news of migrants rushing to their villages in the absence of a proper government planning and a policy on how to see these people going home when you suddenly announce a lockdown, turned out to be the biggest story, I think, of the year, or maybe let's say if it was a humanitarian crisis. We saw such stories: people dying on roads, being crushed by trains, and between them, you also find a story where a Muslim friend and a Hindu friend were going back home, and the one of them died, and the other fellow did not leave him because they were friends. Then you also find the story of this girl Jyoti Yadav, who cycles his father all the way to village. So you have to find bad and good news in bad news and bad news in good news. I think there has to be a fine balance. But news is a news, good, bad, ugly, whatever. But that's our job, is to show the mirror to the
Thanks,
society.
Vinita. Let me move on to Venkat.
Yeah.
Venkat, you started with India is a country of 1 million or 100,000 publications, 1,000 TV channels. And then we saw comments from our other colleagues talking about, commercialization of news, and especially with the advent of digital media and social media, which is sort of running amok. Everybody is controlled. There's no control. There's no guiding it. There's nobody deciding what to put on or not to put on. So journalism goes out of the window. This is citizen journalism, and people are motivated or have vested interest. So, what's your take on this particular aspect? What is bad news and good news, and is it only determined by commercial news?
I think we have right. Uh, the press in India is so diverse. You have 100,000 publications, more than 10,000 daily newspapers, weeklies, magazines, and you have nearly 1,000 channels. So it's impossible for any single entity to control or determine what these TV channels or newspapers are going to write or publish. But television, I find, has become less than responsible. They always go for controversial stuff, or the anchors don't really do their homework, and they try to look for sensationalism in anything they do, because that's what makes people see what they're seeing on the on television channels. Same thing with the newspapers. Take today's newspapers, for example. You have most of the stories are, I would say, they're not positive, they're negative. Except I think the Hindustan Times ran a story about India being able to kind of, control the spread of COVID, the number of people who are dying per million population compared to other countries is not as bad as it is for a country with a population of 1.38 billion people. But generally, when I read a newspaper, or when I watch, in fact, I must admit that I don't watch television anymore for the simple reason that the way the anchors try to kind of interpret news, and instead of giving straight news, it tends to put me off. In any case, all day I'm keeping a watch on what is happening on the computer, social media, and digital media, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I get the feeling that, hey, things are not right with the world, and there is a certain kind of feel bad, but I would like to feel good. There should be at least some good news which makes you feel okay, not everything is lost with the world and all that. But I also know that in England, somebody tried to run a newspaper called Good Newspaper, and they had to wind up in less than a week because nobody was willing to read that newspaper. So it's a dilemma, Roland. But overall, I agree with the point you're making that the news at the end of the day leaves viewers and readers and listeners depressed about the state of the world. And we should really make a conscious effort to kind of, present news in such a way that people do not lose hope. They should hope for a better tomorrow. That's what I think. Thank you, Manish.
Before I come back to Roland, because I'm going to switch back to you, Roland, but I want to make a comment. You see, one of my very good old friends, he died unfortunately slightly young, C.K. Prahlad. He had talked about, focusing on bad practices because people started focusing only on best practices and never got to the end of it. So we've talked about the bad practices. We would love to hear from you with your background and experience on dealing with the subject as to what could be the best practices to move from bad news to good news. But before that, see, there was a time when journalism and media got the label of the fourth estate. It was based a lot on ethics, morality, people being of academic bent of mind, literary figures not coming in simply because they did some curriculum or a course and signed up for journalism to become stars on the idiot box. But we've moved away from that to turn media into an industry. Media demanded that it wanted to become an industry. It wanted that acknowledgement. It wanted that commercialization. So in all this situation, what are the best practices? What is the pathway that you recommend so that we can get from bad news to good news, or whichever way, we are talking?
Well, first of all, please don't get me wrong. I don't want good news. What I want is news. It's not about greenwashing or putting everything into a pink picture. That's not what it is about. But what we can see with our data when we watch the evening news from BBC, from America, day by day, story by story, we see more and more that our friends, for different reasons, are no longer presenting the whole picture. That is what is worrying me. Coming back to the example of soccer or of cricket, we get the score how UK played against India, but we don't get the Indians score. And we all know if that would happen only once, all journalists would be fired. So why are we allowing this when it comes to the presentation of the state of the economy, health, university, other countries? To give you an idea from the one who is not living in India, as I love your country so much, I'm irritated how little I see about India when I open the newspapers, when I open the magazines, when I watch the evening news. I get a lot of stories from China, but I find very little on India. I find almost nothing on Vietnam. If you would ask my grandma what's going on in Vietnam, or if I would tell her that I have an office in Vietnam, she would get a heart attack, because the last time she heard about Vietnam was during the Vietnam War. There's something wrong in the way how we select news, how we present the news to our audience. There's something completely wrong how we do our audience checks. I know there's a lot going on in each newspaper, in each radio show. They try to figure out, are our viewers, is our audience satisfied? But I think we can do better. And that is why I was so excited when AJ and Venkat reached out, because from all what I know about India is that your country is not only so diverse and full of rich, intelligent people, that you figured out tackling one problem just on your own. Remember, you changed your law, I think 20 years ago, where you asked successful business leaders that they should put 2% of their profits into a foundation. The result is that your schools, your kindergartens, even your universities flourished a lot. Why? Because most of these successful businessmen, company leaders, I want to say, or business leaders, they decided that education is so important because they need skilled employees in future. So how about if now these business leaders contribute 0.5% to what our friend was mentioning earlier on? Where are these best practices in Indian media? Where are best practice journalism in the world? You know, what always struck me was we have Nobel Prizes on almost everything. We have a Nobel Prize on chemical, on physics, on medicine, even on the economics. But there is no one Nobel Prize for the media. I never understood this, because what is touching everybody's lives every day, 24/7, 365 days? That's what you do with your teams in TV, in print, in radio, wherever you serve as a journalist. What you do, that matters, because what people see, they can react on. But the other thing is true as well. What they don't see, they can't react on. And that is what I like about Ulrich Hagerup's initiative on constructive journalism. And let me tell you, at the first conference which he did, it was not just one journalist attending, it was already 500 journalists, because there's a big hunger. What can we do different in order not to please our audience, but to leave the audience at the end of the day with this clear understanding: we were served right. What we saw was worthwhile watching. And I would love to get back to that.
Can I ask a question here, really? I just came to my mind during this discussion debate. How do we categorize a bad news or a good news?
Roland, you want to take that question?
Sure. Well, at the first glance, it's very simple. Bad news would be that there's a catastrophe happening, and it destroys lives and it destroys future. That is what my grandma would frame as a negative news. My grandma would then frame as a positive news how people were helped in this region, how they were able to rebuild their villages. And that is what I criticize with a lot of media outlets. They cover the destruction, the earthquake, the collapse of something, but it seems to be difficult for them to come back to the same story 1 month later, 3 months later, 1 year later, to find out what happened with this school. Was it rebuilt? We have a lot of conversation about the lack of digitalization and that the young people have no access to computers, etc. in schools. That's one story. But the second story would be, okay, after we reported that some schools have no access to internet, etc., was this fixed? Or is this still a problem? And I wouldn't mind both stories, because if it's still unfixed 3 months later, we should report that as well. As we should report 3 months later if this is no longer of a problem. That's why I'm a little bit defendant when somebody tells me good stories, bad news, only bad news are good news. We all know that this is not really true, because if you look into your sports section, your audience doesn't want to read every day that your team is a team of losers. Nobody wants to read in the local section of the newspaper that the school where your kids go to, that they are selling drugs and nobody learns a peep every day. And we know that the sports section and the local section is the most read section. And we know at the same time, in both of these sections of our newspapers, we can't fool them. But it seems that we can fool them a lot when it comes to economics. We can tell the world that this is the biggest crisis due to Corona since even worse than World War II. But I don't see this backed by any numbers. And that was already the case back in 2008 after Lehman collapse. It was the case 2 years later when the Greek crisis was. It was always this over-exaggerating of prognosis when it comes to economics. And then 6 months later, 12 months later, 24 months later, we realized it wasn't actually that bad, because thank God, the world is no longer so dependent on America, for instance. Countries like India are on the map. Countries like Vietnam are contributing a lot to the balancing out of the global economy. It's no longer true what I learned at university 35 years ago. If America catches a cold, the rest of the world has tremendous problems. This is no longer exactly in the same way the case. Germany, Europe, Asia, African countries, they all developed a lot. And that's fascinating to see. But if my grandma is not aware of it, because when she opens her newspaper, she hardly finds any story about India or Vietnam, I think we are cheating on my grandma. And I hate that.
Thank you. I wanted to get back to Tim, because Tim, you said you were waiting on Roland to finish a few comments. Do you have any comments or questions, Tim? Tim?
Yes, I think it's still a fine line between what is good and bad news. So it's very easy for us to criticize different media, but there's still a huge media industry out there, and overall I think we're doing a pretty good job in very difficult economic circumstances at the moment, covering all the different stories out there. If I take AFP because I know about it, we're suffering really badly from the economy, but we're still covering all these things and different people are using them. So just because Roland's grandmother, but we can't read about India or Vietnam, there are other stories out there, so they are accessible if people, I'm not saying Roland's grandmother needs to read it. But the stories are definitely out there, and just as Sanjeev said, cover the development, a lot of people cover developments now. We cover things like that as much as we cover the cricket in India, and we put huge resources into that. So let's not be too negative about the media. I think.
Okay.
Can I jump on that?
Sure.
Tim, you are
Go ahead.
totally right that it's the job of an agency to cover all of that. But that is not giving you a fair response whether my grandma, who can only subscribe to maybe 1 or 2 newspapers, that in these newspapers which she has subscribed to, she hardly finds stories on Vietnam. She hardly finds stories on India. That is what I'm meaning. And vice versa. I'm not so sure whether Khaled Times has stories about Finland, that, for instance, Finland managed to change within the last 30 years, that you have the most satisfied people living in this Nordic country. Whereas 30 years ago, this country was the country with the highest amount of people committing suicides. How often are Indian media covering stories from Finland? You can do your homework and don't tell me you found one story on Nokia, because that's exactly the point. Having one story is not making the difference. This one story or 3 stories or 5 stories over a period of 1 year is almost like no story. That is what our research over the last 25 years prove to a scientific degree, that if you don't have an ongoing news flow, which is beyond 1.5% of all the stories you put on air in BBC or in India Times or whatever media outlet, everything underneath 1.5% is almost as if it's not existing. And that is good management of media outlets. That is what I expect an editor-in-chief or the editor who is in charge of the business section or the foreign section or all the other sections to take care of in future.
I have a question for you, Roland. You're part of a center or foundation, I guess, that talks about UN Sustainable Development Goals. How much of what appears in media, you must have done a lot of research, how much of what appears in media is helping drive and achieve the UN SDGs or not?
Good question. Well, first of all, what I can tell you is that this whole development of the Sustainable Development Goals is undercovered, if you want. You probably know the work of the friends in Denmark who are capturing development on a global scale. How is the world developing? And asking people. And nowhere, in no part of the world, you receive the right answers. People are always too pessimistic about the development of the world in regards to education, in regards to even survival, in regards to food quality, etc., etc. All aspects which are covered by these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. When you ask the ordinary citizen in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in North America, you always get a big wrong answer. People always have the impression things developed not as fast as they have developed. There are more people dying than actually are dying. The overall development in economic growth, etc., is not understood in the way as it is developing. And that, to a certain degree, has a reason in what the people can see and read in the evening news.
Venkat, anybody else for any more comments or questions? Oh, Venkat has disappeared. Oh my God.
I think if I may allow Manish just final
Please.
word on this. I think what we need is for an agency also is not necessarily all the news can be reported, because the agency wanted to sell the news and there are people who subscribe to take it. So that's one issue. But the other issue also comes to my mind is how much really of these news can be sold to the people. Not everybody really interested in this. So therefore, we are falling at the line. Ethically speaking, I fully agree with you, Ronald, because there is no follow-up. Many cases we have, like I've seen a case in the flood in Bangladesh, where our friend, the prize winners of the best photograph 10 years ago, 1998, he went back after 10 years to do the same shooting of the picture of the same group he took. So for them, it was something, for an academic, for an interest of the newspaper that he won the prize in France. But for us to follow up in issues, the story of a controversial or a story which we have run, like I did a story on stem cells, therapy. And I had more than 2 lakhs people asking me on the Twitters that please, on the story, how can we get the treatment? But at the same time, I did a follow-up story to tell the people that, look, I have no commercial link to this, but I need to tell you that not everybody get the treatment can recover. So I had to give a full stop here. But I think that depends on you as a journalist. But if I'm working in a media house, and I think Tim will agree with me, it may be of some interest to the agency to carry the story or do a follow-up in that.
I don't know if Tim wants to comment on that, but on what you just said, Dr. Awad. But this is a great subject. This has been a great conversation. We can always drive this issue into the ground. What is good news? What is bad news? How do you weigh and balance putting out good and bad news, and not just putting it out, but also carriage of it on media itself, which is not the job of journalists, but the publishers of print, television, radio channels and media. So it's sort of a shared responsibility, and it is also the shared responsibility of the citizens and the politicians and the social groups that make the news, or should be making the news, or should be highlighting the good and the bad and the ugly and right and wrong and follow-ups, to also participate in that process. So I think putting the finger on just the guys covering the news to say they are the sole points of deciding and servicing the whole world with what should be good or bad news may not be the answer to this, Roland, but it's a good starting point. If I, as a journalist, can tune myself to saying that, look, I must carry both sides of the story. I want to present a holistic picture. I would like the world to know what's really happening, and not just sensationalism and driving headlines using critical, sort of news. That's my onus. But the buck doesn't start or stop with me. It has to go, the mile, the many places. But that's my feeling. But a great discussion, a great sort of subject that we must carry forward. And my last sentence that I would say on this is that I travel the world. I show news on India. I carry a show called the Daily India Report, and I've decided, for my own sake, because I am the publisher, I am the one who creates, and it's my money. I decided that I just show the changing face of India every day. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, some of it is ugly, some of it is transitional, but I just show it as is, and I don't get into what's right, what's wrong. Let people decide. And on the other side, in Africa and North America and other places you were talking about, Roland, it's developing countries need to focus on developmental journalism as a part of what they teach, as a part of what they profess in terms of morals, ethics, responsibility of citizens as such, not just media houses and journalism. And then I think we'll get around to probably tackling the subject that we have in front of us today. It's not just a one-sided picture, one-sided story. Thank you. Any final comments before we close, Roland?
Well, what we do is now, in 1 month, a bit more than 1 month, we will be in the German Parliament asking and discussing the question, why do we have reports on the status of children, of education, of senior citizens, of almost everything, which are presented to the national parliament once per year? Why don't we have a report, how informed are the Germans every year? What do they see and what do they not see? And maybe the parliament will take this on and turn it into annual report, which we can then share with you and with your parliament, because I think that could be a good starting point. I love data. and without data, we get very quickly opinionized, and we lose track.
That'd be great. That'd be great, and we welcome you again. I think this is just the beginning of a relationship that we can traverse together. We have a
Pleasure.
huge variety of people, as you've seen, a diversity of people from different parts of the world, foreign correspondents as well as Indian journalists. So I think it'll be fun intermingling and sort of sharing ideas
Yes.
and bouncing things back and forth. And thank you certainly for sharing your experience and your expertise. And we'll be back in touch with you again. I would like to thank all the audience that is watching us on behalf of the Foreign Correspondents Club of South Asia. I certainly want to thank all our panelists, starting with Roland and Simran, Dr. Awad, Tim, Vinita, and of course Venkat, who had to leave, and also Sanjeev Miglani, who had to leave, and Anand Sai. But great to have all of you here with us and representing the diversity of India and the world that's present in India today. Thank you and good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ronald. Thank you. Thank you, Manish.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.